In one of the most prestigious universities in the country, a packed lecture hall hummed with the low murmurs of students preparing for yet another grueling lesson. The room was massive, with rows upon rows of seats sloping upward, filled with bright young minds eager to prove themselves. At the very front stood a towering chalkboard, already covered in layers of complex equations from earlier discussions. The professor, renowned, feared, and undeniably arrogant, paced in front of it, his sharp suit pressed to perfection, his golden hair neatly combed, and his gaze sharp as a blade. Professor Jonathan Collins had spent years cultivating a reputation as one of the toughest, most brilliant mathematicians in academia. His lectures were legendary, not for their educational value, but for his brutal, condescending style. He didn't teach so much as he challenged, as if every student in his class had to earn the right to sit there. He was known for embarrassing those who asked stupid questions, belittling students who hesitated in their answers, and making it clear that intelligence, in his eyes, was a rare gift, one that he believed most of his students lacked. But today, there was someone new in his lecture hall. Leonard Miller sat quietly near the middle of the room. He was different. Not just because he was older, but because he carried himself with an unusual sense of calm. While the students around him fidgeted with their notebooks, anxiously awaiting the professor's arrival, Leonard sat still, hands folded on his desk, his dark brown eyes fixed ahead. Deep wrinkles lined his dark skin, his short gray hair neatly combed, and his simple sweater and slacks stood in stark contrast to the hoodies and jeans of the young students surrounding him. Leonard wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. He wasn't chasing a degree for career advancement. He had already lived an entire lifetime, worked for decades, and raised a family. He was here for one reason, his love for mathematics. But to Professor Collins, Leonard wasn't a student. He was a joke. The moment Collins laid eyes on him during the first week of class, he had smirked. He had made snide remarks, not outright cruel, but laced with condescension. "Mr. Miller, I admire your enthusiasm," he had said once, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "It's never too late to learn. Though, I must warn you, this is a rather advanced course. Perhaps you'd find something more introductory to be a better fit?" Leonard had only smiled politely. "I think I'll manage." And he did. Week after week, Leonard attended every lecture, taking careful notes, never missing a single assignment. His responses in discussions were thoughtful, precise. Some students were impressed. Others, like Collins, were simply amused. But today, everything would change. Collins entered the lecture hall with his usual air of superiority, carrying a piece of chalk between his fingers. He turned to the board, and without a word, began writing. Lines and symbols spread across the surface, a daunting equation forming before the students' eyes. He didn't just write a difficult problem, he crafted a monster. Something well beyond their syllabus, something even experienced mathematicians might struggle with. Then, he turned back to the class, smirking. "All right," he said, brushing his hands together. "Who's feeling particularly brilliant today?" Silence. The students shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Collins let the pause stretch, relishing their discomfort. Then, his eyes landed on Leonard. A slow, predatory smile crept onto his face. "Mr. Miller," he said, voice oozing with mock enthusiasm. "Perhaps you'd like to take a stab at this?" A few students chuckled, sensing the professor's intent. Others exchanged uneasy glances. Leonard, as always, remained calm. He adjusted his glasses, studied the equation for a moment, then, without a word, he stood up. The room fell into absolute silence. Slowly, he made his way to the front of the class, his steps measured, steady. He took the chalk from the professor's hand, turned to the board, and simply stared at the equation. Collins crossed his arms, smirk widening. He was waiting for Leonard to hesitate, to stumble, to admit he was in over his head. But that didn't happen. Leonard took a breath, and began writing. At first, his method seemed unfamiliar to the students. Instead of attacking the equation in a linear way, he broke it down into smaller, more manageable pieces, recognizing patterns others hadn't. His hand moved swiftly, fluidly, not hesitating once. The smirk on Colin's face twitched. As Leonard worked, a shift occurred in the room. Students leaned forward, watching intently. Murmurs spread as they started to realize, this wasn't random. Leonard wasn't guessing. He knew exactly what he was doing. Minutes passed. Line after line appeared, each step following a perfect, logical progression. The impossibly complex equation was unraveling right before their eyes. Colin's arms uncrossed. His jaw tightened. He stepped closer, scanning for an error, a miscalculation, anything he could use to discredit Leonard. There was nothing. Finally, Leonard reached the last line. He set the chalk down, turned to the class, and stepped aside. Silence. The students didn't know what to say. Colin stared at the board, his face unreadable. His fingers twitched at his side. Then, finally, he spoke. His voice was strained. This is correct. Gasps rippled through the room. Then, as if a floodgate had opened, the students erupted into applause. Some even stood. A few exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. Collins clenched his jaw. He forced a tight-lipped smile. Impressive, Mr. Miller. Very impressive. But the damage was done. The arrogance, the smug superiority he had carried for years, it had been shattered in a matter of minutes by the very person he had underestimated. Leonard simply nodded, offering a small, knowing smile. Mathematics doesn't care about age, Professor, he said. Only understanding. With that, he returned to his seat. From that day forward, the way students looked at Leonard, and the way they looked at Collins, changed forever. Leonard was no longer just an elderly man taking classes for fun. He was a reminder that knowledge had no expiration date, that brilliance could come from anywhere. And Collins? He learned a lesson he never expected, one that wouldn't be forgotten anytime soon. Collins hesitated before speaking again. He glanced at the chalkboard, then back at Leonard, as if trying to process what had just happened. For the first time in years, he wasn't the smartest person in the room, and he knew it. His pride told him to brush it off, to regain control of the class, but the silence that followed was deafening. The students, still staring at Leonard with admiration, no longer saw Collins as the untouchable genius he once pretended to be. He cleared his throat, straightened his suit, and forced a nod. "Well done, Mr. Miller," he muttered, barely audible. But everyone in that room knew the truth. This wasn't just a simple equation being solved. It was a lesson in humility, and for once, Collins was the one being schooled. What do you think? Have you ever seen arrogance crumble in the face of true intelligence? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.